We've been talking about the cycle of loving neighbors, moving them to loving God, getting them to fall in love with God, of course, the two greatest commandments, and then shifting them, moving them to serving others. Our theme this year is God first. Our theme verse is Deuteronomy 6:7. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. This quarter, we're talking about God and work. We're about to wrap up the third quarter of this year, if you can believe that. This year is flying by. But we're talking about God and work, not just the God in the workplace, but the way that we work as Christians, the way that we work for God with other Christians. How do we integrate God into everything that we do? You guys may remember this story. It's a pretty recent story, but it's a guy by the name of John Rise. He's from L.A., California, and recently he found about 800,000 pennies. Do you guys remember this story? It was in a crawl space in the basement. It was in his in-laws' house. They had both passed away. And him and his wife were going through the house, and in a really obscure crawl space in the basement, they found what amounted to about 800,000 pennies. They contacted different banks, and the banks said, we don't want them. They said, we don't have enough room in the vault. Wells Fargo said, it's not really worth our time. Please don't bring the pennies here. So they were faced with a dilemma. What do we do with all of these pennies? And they found out that the reason the father-in-law, John's father-in-law, was saving these pennies is because he knew that they were going to start reducing the amount of copper that they were putting in pennies. And so he wanted to save all these copper pennies that were true copper pennies because one day they might be worth a lot of money. And so one of the banks told John Rise that you probably have $1 million penny mixed in there somewhere because they're collectors. All of these pennies are pre-1971 or something like that. But somewhere in there, you probably have a pretty valuable penny that a collector's going to pay a lot of money for. So they started going through the pennies, and they went through about 300 of them in an hour. And then they just gave up. And they're like, it's not really worth our time. So they auctioned them off for $25,000. And I never saw a follow-up story, but I assume there were probably some collectors who bought the whole stash. But 800,000 pennies, by the way, is worth about $8,000. So not a whole lot of money, but it's kind of interesting. And this one caught the attention of people just because it was really unique. But it's not that uncommon. In the same story that talks about that, I'm going to read a paragraph. It says, Rise and his wife aren't the first to stumble across major coin discoveries. In 2014, another California couple found $10 million of gold coins buried in their yard. So kids, let's get digging in our yard because you never know what we'll find. In 2019, a couple in North Yorkshire, England, found 800,000 worth of coins under their kitchen floor. And I was kind of researching this a little bit, and it's not that uncommon. People find stashes, and sometimes there aren't stories about them. Just people post on Quora and different places, and they're like, hey, I found, this one woman found $250,000 in one chest in her parents' home. And then she found another area with something like $30,000 stuffed in that in cash. And so it's kind of interesting, right? People stuff money. And for whatever reason, they stuff money and they're like, well, we'll get to it later. And so I found some commonalities among people who stuff money. Number one, nobody knew that they had wealth. Every story that I've read, family members were like, well, we didn't know that they had money. We just always assumed that they were broke and, they lived these really meager lives, and we had no idea that they had all this money. Number two, they never shared their wealth with anybody. When family members talk about it, not only did they not know that they had wealth, but they never really shared it with anybody. And so that's kind of interesting too. They kept it to themselves. Number three, they never multiplied their wealth. These people who bury the money didn't invest it. They just collected money and they kind of stuffed it in an obscure place in the house. One guy said that stuffed in suit pockets of his dad was all these $100 bills. And he was going through the closets, and every closet he came to, about every other suit had $100 bills just stuffed in the pockets. But they never multiplied their wealth. I told you about the woman who found the chest with $250,000 and another one with $30,000. If she would have, if the parents would have invested that money over the course of 30 years, it would have been worth about $2.5 million. But they didn't invest. They didn't multiply the wealth. And then finally, what's interesting is they kept all this money but didn't have a purpose for it. They never left instructions. They didn't have, I haven't found any of these couples that I found where their parents or whoever left the money, they didn't leave a will. Not one instance of somebody leaving a will saying, here's how I want this money to be used, or here's who I want the money to go to, which leaves a lot of confusion. The poor woman who found the almost $300,000 or over $300,000 in these chests was asking questions like, is this money rightfully mine? These are my parents. I'm an only child. And you want to know what the answer is from attorneys? It's not that straightforward. They're like, you're going to have to hire attorneys. You're going to have to prove that the cash was actually in the house. You have to know what your parents' intentions were, even if they didn't have a will written. And so it's like basically a legal nightmare. And so these people never left instructions. They didn't pass on information for how to use this wealth. So this is interesting in light of the story that we're going to read today. We heard a portion of this story, but it's actually a pretty lengthy story that Jesus tells, this parable of the talents. We're going to read it in full, and then we're going to kind of unpack it here. Jesus said, "For it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents. By the way, a talent was a silver coin worth approximately $1,000. It'd be today worth about $1,000 US. Tomorrow it would be worth about $950, the way inflation keeps going, but roughly $1,000. If it was a Syrian coin that Jesus referred to, a Syrian denarii, it'd be worth about $275. So either way, worth a pretty significant amount of money. So he gave 5 of these talents to one person, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over little, I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also, who had the 2 talents, came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here, I've made 2 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over little, I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours." But his master answered him, "You wicked and slothful servant." That word for slothful means reluctant. Somebody who's reluctant to do or to take action. Somebody who's slow to take action. "You wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him." This is second person plural, so he's talking to a group of people. "You all take this talent from him and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." That's a phrase that Jesus often uses when he's talking about hell. When he talks about being cast out, you'll be in a place where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. He's talking about a place of torment. He's talking about hell. Jesus often uses parables to have double meanings. I think this is a case where Jesus is using a double meaning. Certainly he's talking about being fruitful with what God has blessed us with physically, but he's also talking about kingdom work. He's talking about using the gifts that God gives us. That's Paul's language, talking about what God gives us. Also, Paul uses Jesus' language, each according to what God has given him, each according to his ability. Paul uses that language in 1 Corinthians when he's talking about spiritual gifts that God gives us. God gives us, he grants us gifts according to our abilities. And I wonder, I don't know, but I wonder, going back to this, how many people who are not Christians have no idea that God has blessed us with gifts? How many people look at Christians and have no idea that we have abilities, that we have gifts, that we have certain ways that we can connect with people, talk to people, relate to people? How many people have no idea that we're hoarding these spiritual gifts? How many Christians never share what God has gifted us with other people? I don't know the answer to it, but I wonder. How many Christians never multiply the gifts that God has blessed us with? If we look around at the state of the church in the United States right now, just in the past 2 years, there's been a dive off of a cliff in church membership, which means people are no longer transferring from church to church. They're leaving the church for good. Now, to be fair, there are a lot of house churches that are springing up, small house churches, and I think there's going to be a movement, there's going to be a shift in culture from traditional church services at a church building. There's going to be a shift to lay people becoming preachers and leading house churches, and I think and I hope that movement is really going to take off. I don't think the church is doomed. I don't think the church is going to die. But I think church as we know it is certainly shifting. We see evidence of that. But along with that is that many Christians, many professed Christians are leaving the church and are not going to the house church culture. They're leaving the church altogether. How many Christians are not multiplying their wealth? And how many never pass that on? How many never give instructions to their kids for how to use the gifts that God has given us? How many people don't instruct their kids how to use their own gifts, how to find what their gifts are that God's given them, and how to put that into action? And how many people are not discipling their children? I don't know the answer to that, but I wonder. There's an interesting passage. You all know that I love this passage. I've preached from it many times. I've taught from it many times. I love this passage because Luke is one of my favorite authors in the entire Bible, especially when you look at what he does in the original language. Luke is a master of using certain phrases and certain time tenses, and he's really good at kind of taking a different perspective and taking a camera, the lens that he's looking at the world through, and he angles it around and he gives you different perspectives. And I love the way that Luke writes. I just love the way that Luke writes. He's very detail-oriented when he writes. And in Acts chapter 6, he's writing about this issue of the handing out food to the widows, right? There's an issue of food distribution. There are certain widows who are being overlooked, and there's kind of this discrimination going on. And so the evangelists are approached, the preachers are approached, and they're like, you guys need to help us distribute food. We need more people to help. And I love their response starting in verse 2 of Acts 6. And the 12 summoned the full number of the disciples and said, it is not right. They don't say it's our opinion. They don't say we don't feel like it. They don't say, well, we're going to go a different route. They say it is not right. Matter of factly, it is not right that we should give up preaching the word of God to serve tables. They were given a gift, and they knew how to use that gift. They knew how to display that gift, and they knew how to multiply that gift. It is not right for us that we should give up preaching the word of God to serve tables. Therefore, brothers, pick out from among you 7 men of good repute, full of the Spirit and of wisdom, who we will appoint to this duty. But we will devote ourselves to prayer and to the ministry of the word. That's their gift. They're not hoarding it. They're not stuffing it under a mattress. They're not saying, well, let's just hold on to this because one day our master is going to return and we want to be able to give this gift back to him. They didn't do that, did they? They used their gift. They displayed their gift, they multiplied their gift, and they passed it on to other people. They showed other people. Paul took Timothy, and Titus for that matter, but he took young Timothy, took him under his wing, and he discipled him, took him out with both feet running onto the mission trail, taught him how to preach. If you remember Timothy's background, this was a bizarre candidate for preaching. All the way around. Timothy was a very bizarre candidate for preaching, but Paul took him and discipled him. And he passed that gift on. And this is what I love about Luke in verse 7. The word of God continued to increase, and the number of the disciples multiplied greatly in Jerusalem. And a great many of the priests became obedient to the faith. There's so much packed into that one verse. It's unreal. First of all, Luke's been using addition up to this point. The Lord added to the church daily those who are being saved, right? We can all recite that. We're all Acts chapter 2 people. The Lord added to the church daily those who are being saved. He keeps using addition, adding. You get to this little section here where they say it's not right for us to give up preaching in order to wait on tables. They kind of appoint a few people to do the food distribution. They keep preaching. And then he uses the word multiplied greatly. And he doesn't stop there. A great many of the priests became obedient to the faith. These are Jewish priests who are leading synagogues, who had a lot of influence in Jewish circles, and they're not only listening to the word of God, they're obeying it. They're becoming Christians. And so now these leaders of the synagogues are doing what? Assumedly, they're teaching and instructing the members of their synagogue about Jesus Christ. They're multiplying their gift. I love this passage. I love what it stands for, and it makes me wonder how many Christians are taking their giftedness and sitting on it. They're parking it. They're not using it, or they're hoarding it. They're keeping it to themselves. They're not sharing it with people. They're not multiplying it. Nobody even knows that they have the gifts, and they certainly don't give instructions for how to use it when they're gone. How many people are living life that way right now? I think it's a message for all of us that whatever gifts we have, we shouldn't be slothful. We shouldn't be reluctant to use it. And if you notice, the reason he's slothful, the reason he's reluctant is because of fear. Now, it's not necessarily fear for how the master would react. A lot of times it's fear driven by, well, I just don't know. I don't know how to put this gift into motion. I don't know how to use it. I don't know what to do with it. All of us know, all of us who are sitting here right now, I don't care how young you are, I don't care how old you are, all of us know what it is to be gripped by fear, to have reluctance to do something because we're like, well, I don't know how that's going to pan out. And so it's safer to not try it because it might not work out and people might laugh at me. Or I might look like a fool. I might try this and I might look like a fool because it failed and it didn't work. And Jesus says about those servants, get away from me, you wicked and slothful servant. Take this person away to where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. God's judgment comes down hard on people, not who fail, but people who fail to put their gifts into motion. God has given us incredible gifts. He's given us abilities. He's given us material things. He's given us jobs. He's given us so many abilities. And let's not squander that. Let's not hide it. Let's not be reluctant to put them into motion. Spend every day blessing people, helping people. I don't care what it looks like. I don't care how sloppy it looks. I don't care how unorganized it looks. But spend every day getting into the practice of blessing people in whatever way you see fit to the gifts that God has given you. And I promise God will bless that. What God won't bless, and we know this for a fact, what God won't bless is people who have gifts and they don't use them. That message is yours. If there's anybody who's not yet taken the step to put Christ on in baptism, or if you have prayer needs,